Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, this is the kind of place where history meets a very comfortable pillow. We don't rush through anything. We don't shout about revelations. We just talk, slowly, about people who have been dead for 1,000 years, and whose problems, while genuinely interesting, are absolutely not yours to worry about. So go ahead and dim those lights. Pull your blanket up a little. Maybe put your phone face down on the nightstand. Or don't, since you're listening to this anyway. Either way, get comfortable, because tonight we are heading a very long way back in time. We're going north. We're going cold. We're going to the world of the Vikings. And specifically, because we like to do things a little differently here. We're not talking about the raids. We're not talking about the longships or the battle axes or the horned helmets that they did not actually wear, by the way. No, tonight we are talking about the women, the Viking women, the ones who stayed home, the ones who sailed, the ones who ran the farm, raised the children, buried the dead, made the mead, negotiated the marriages, and occasionally picked up a sword if they felt like it. Because here's the thing about Viking women that most people don't think about. The popular image of the Viking world is almost entirely male. Big bearded men on boats. Odin and Thor and Loki causing chaos. Warriors at feasts. Jarls making decisions. But behind all of that, woven into the very fabric of Norse society, were women who had a surprisingly significant amount of power, independence, and legal standing compared to almost every other culture in the medieval world at the same time. And that's interesting. That's genuinely interesting. Not exciting, not shocking, just quietly, pleasantly interesting, which is exactly the kind of interesting we like here. So let's begin. The Viking Age, for our purposes tonight, runs roughly from around 793 CE, when Norse raiders hit the monastery at Lindisfarne on the northeastern coast of England and basically announced themselves to the rest of Europe, to around 1066 CE, when the Norman conquest of England marks a kind of cultural turning point. About 270 years, give or take, of Norse expansion, exploration, trade, settlement, and yes, occasional violence. The Vikings came primarily from what we now call Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They also came from Iceland, which was itself settled by Norse people starting around 874 CE, and from those places they went pretty much everywhere. They went west to the British Isles and Ireland. They went south and east through the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They reached Constantinople. They reached North Africa. They reached Newfoundland in Canada, roughly 500 years before Columbus. These were a people who moved, who pushed outward, who kept going until there was nothing left to go toward. But not everyone went. Someone had to stay, and that someone was, very often, the women. Now, before we get into the details of daily life, and we will get into the details, all of them, very slowly, let's just set the scene a little. What did the Norse world actually look like? Imagine, if you will, a landscape of fjords and forests and long gray coastlines. Rocky ground that is hard to farm but not impossible. Winters that are genuinely brutal in a way that makes modern winter complaints feel a little silly. Short summers that burst into almost frantic productivity. Animals everywhere, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, goats. Farmhouses that smell like smoke and wet wool and whatever was cooking over the central hearth, which was always something. The Norse people lived in longhouses. The clue is in the name. These were long, rectangular buildings, sometimes 30 or 40 meters long, with the central hearth running down the middle. The walls were made of wood or turf, depending on what was available. There were no windows to speak of, which meant the interior was smoky and dim. Lit by the hearth and by oil lamps that burned fish oil or animal fat, the smell was, let's say, atmospheric. The Longhouse was home to the family, yes, but also to the animals during winter. On one end, you'd have the living quarters. On the other end, separated by a partition wall, you'd have the livestock. Cows, sheep, maybe a horse. Sharing body heat with the people in ways that were practical rather than sentimental. You didn't cuddle the cow because you loved it. You kept the cow inside because it kept you from freezing to death, and also because the cow kept you from starving. This was the world Viking women were born into, and they ran it. Let's talk about status first, because status in the source world was a complicated thing, and it touched everything, including how much freedom a woman had and how much say she had over her own life. Norse society was divided broadly into three groups. There were the thralls, who were enslaved people, captured in raids, bought in markets, or born into slavery. There were the carls, who were free farmers and craftspeople, the broad working middle of Norse society. And there were the jarls, the nobility, the landowners, the chiefs, the wealthy. Women existed at every level of this hierarchy. A thrall woman had essentially no legal rights, and her life was frankly grim. A carl woman had a degree of legal protection and social standing that was modest but real. A jarl woman, a woman of high birth and good marriage, could have quite a lot of power. Not unlimited power, not equality in any modern sense, but more than you might expect. The Norse legal system, which varied by region but followed certain common principles, recognized women as people with legal standing. They could own property. They could inherit. They could initiate divorce. They could testify in legal proceedings. They had rights over their own dowry. These were not small things. In the same period in Anglo-Saxon England, or in the Frankish Empire, or in the Byzantine world, women's legal standing was considerably more circumscribed. Now, does this mean Viking women were free in any modern sense of the word? No, absolutely not. They were subject to male authority, fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Their marriages were arranged. Their lives were shaped by expectations of domestic labor and childbearing. But within those constraints, there was more room to move than history sometimes gives them credit for. And that room is what we're going to explore tonight. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with a girl being born. Birth in the Norse world was, like birth everywhere in the pre-modern world, a genuinely risky business. Maternal mortality was high. Infant mortality was high. There were no doctors in any meaningful sense. There were midwives and women with knowledge of herbs and practical experience. But there was no anesthesia, no sterile equipment, no way to deal with serious complications. When a Norse woman gave birth, she was attended by other women. The midwife, sometimes called a jordmor, which means something like Earth Mother, would oversee the process. There would be prayers to Frigg, the goddess associated with marriage and motherhood, and to other deities. There would be charms spoken. There would be practical help, warm water, clean cloth, strong hands to hold on to. If the birth went well, the child arrived into a smoky longhouse, was cleaned, wrapped in cloth, and placed in its mother's arms. And then, and this is a detail that tends to make modern people uncomfortable, the decision was made about whether the child would live. Because not every child born in the Norse world was raised. The practice of infant exposure, the leaving of an unwanted newborn to die of exposure, existed in the Norse world as it did in many ancient and early medieval cultures. Children born with visible disabilities might be exposed. Children born in times of famine or extreme poverty might be exposed. Children born when the family simply could not support another mouth might be exposed. It was a brutal calculation, made in brutal circumstances. The father typically made the final call. The child was presented to him, literally placed on the floor before him, and he would either pick it up, symbolically accepting it into the family and giving it a name, or he would leave it on the floor, signaling that it would be exposed. If the child was picked up and named, it was a member of the family. It was protected. It was loved, presumably, in the ways that people love children. And the mother, who had just been through the ordeal of childbirth in a smoky longhouse with no painkillers, would now begin the work of keeping this small new person alive. Nursing was the mother's job. Norse women breastfed their children, often for 2 or 3 years. Wet nurses existed among the wealthy, but for most families, the mother did the nursing herself. This had the side effect of suppressing fertility, not reliably and not in any planned way, but extended breastfeeding does reduce the likelihood of another pregnancy in the short term, which was probably a relief in a world where you couldn't really afford to have children too close together. Children in the Norse world grew up quickly by our standards. They were expected to contribute to the household from a young age. Small tasks at first, then more significant ones as they got older. Girls learned from their mothers. Boys learned from their fathers. This wasn't a formal education. There were no schools, no textbooks, no standardized curriculum. It was apprenticeship by observation and practice. A girl growing up in a Norse household would learn to cook, to preserve food, to tend animals, to spin wool, to weave cloth, to sew, to embroider, to manage a household's stores and economy, to brew ale, and to manage the keys. The keys were important. We'll come back to the keys. She would also learn the social skills of her world, how to welcome guests, how to pour the mead at a feast, how to navigate the complex politics of family alliances and neighborly disputes, how to read a situation, how to hold her own in conversation. And she might also, if she was lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, learn something of the wider world. Stories of the gods, knowledge of the runes, the sagas of ancestors. Let's talk about the keys for a moment, because the keys are genuinely one of the most interesting symbols in the whole story of Viking women. The lady of the Norse household was called the husfreyja, which means, roughly, the house lady or the mistress of the house. And her symbol of authority, her literal badge of office, was a ring of keys. These keys hung from her belt or from a brooch at her shoulder. They were usually made of iron, sometimes decorated, sometimes plain. And they unlocked things: chests, storage rooms, the ale room, the pantry, the locked boxes where the household's valuables were kept. In a household where everything you had was what kept you alive through the winter, your stores of grain, your preserved meat, your dried fish, your ale, your cloth, controlling access to those stores was genuine power. Not symbolic power, not decorative power. Real, practical, material power over the survival of the household. The husfreyja decided what was eaten and when. She decided what was kept and what was used. She managed the household economy, which in a farming household was not simple. It involved knowing how much grain you had, how long it needed to last, how many people and animals you needed to feed, what could be sold or traded, what needed to be replenished. This was sophisticated resource management, and it was her job. When a woman married, one of the key symbolic moments of the wedding ceremony was the transfer of the household keys from the mother to the daughter, or from the previous mistress to the new one. It was the moment she became the husfreyja in her own right. It was, in a very real sense, the transfer of power. And when archaeological sites from the Viking Age are excavated, the presence of keys in a burial is one of the clearest indicators that this was a woman of status, a woman who ran a household, a woman who held authority. The keys don't lie. Now let's drift a little further into daily life, because daily life for a Viking woman was, above all things, work, and not just work in an abstract, general sense. Specific, physical, relentless, skilled work that was absolutely essential to keeping everyone alive and clothed and fed. Let's start with textile production. Because textile production was enormous. It was not a hobby. It was not a pleasant afternoon activity. It was a central pillar of the Viking household economy, and it fell almost entirely to the women. Wool was the primary material, and wool began, obviously, with sheep. The sheep were sheared, typically in spring, and the fleece was collected and washed and dried. Then it had to be carded and combed to align the fibers. Then it had to be spun into thread using a drop spindle, a simple tool, just a weighted stick, but requiring considerable skill and practice to produce even, consistent thread. Then the thread had to be woven on a loom into cloth. Then the cloth might be dyed or cut or sewn into garments. This process, from raw fleece to finished garment, took an enormous amount of time. Studies of historical textile production suggest that a single tunic, just one garment, might require dozens or even hundreds of hours of spinning and weaving. Multiply that by every person in the household, plus the cloth needed for trade, plus the sails for boats, which were also woven, and you start to understand what the women's workload actually looked like. Drop spindles have been found at almost every Viking Age archaeological site. They are among the most ubiquitous objects in the Norse world. Women spun while they walked, while they talked, while they supervised children, while they waited for things. The spindle was almost never put down, and this was considered skilled work. Not unskilled labor, not something anyone could do. A woman who could spin fine, even thread and weave complex patterns, was valued and respected. Her work had real economic worth. Cloth was a form of currency in the Norse world. It could be traded, used to pay debts, given as gifts. The woman who produced it was producing wealth. Cooking was another central task. And again, not casual cooking, not warming something up on a stove. Cooking over an open hearth with heavy iron pots and cauldrons, managing a fire that needed to be maintained carefully, because if it went out, you had a serious problem. Preparing food from raw ingredients, grinding grain, butchering animals, salting and smoking, and fermenting things to preserve them. The Norse diet was not safe. It was practical. Porridge made from oats or barley was a staple. Bread was baked, though grain was not always plentiful and bread could be a luxury. Meat and fish were eaten when available, fresh in summer, preserved in winter. Dairy products were important: butter, cheese, skyr, which is a kind of strained yogurt that is still made in Iceland today and has had a recent trendy moment in health food stores, which the Vikings would probably find amusing. Vegetables were grown in garden plots near the Longhouse: cabbage, onions, peas, beans. Herbs were gathered from the wild. Berries were collected in summer and eaten fresh or dried for winter. And then there was ale. Ale was brewed by women, and it was not optional. Water sources in the Viking world were not always safe to drink, and ale, even low-alcohol ale, was a safer and more calorie-dense alternative. It was drunk by everyone, including children, because mild ale with a low alcohol content was simply what you drank if you wanted to stay alive and not get dysentery. Brewing ale was a skilled process. It required malting grain, mashing it, boiling it, adding herbs or other flavorings. Hops were not yet the universal bittering agent they would later become. So brewers used a range of other herbs including yarrow, mugwort, bog myrtle, and fermenting the whole thing. Getting it wrong wasted precious grain and time. Getting it right meant you had something everyone needed. There were Norse women who were particularly known for their brewing skill, and this was a mark of distinction. The ability to brew good ale was a genuine accomplishment. Let's pause here for a moment and just breathe. You've just learned a genuinely significant amount about Viking domestic life, and you didn't even notice because we were going slowly and calmly, and nobody was shouting at you. Well done. The fire is crackling in the Longhouse. The spindle is turning. The ale is fermenting. Everything smells like wool and wood smoke and maybe something faintly of fish. And somewhere in the household, a woman is deciding what gets unlocked today, what gets eaten, what gets woven, what gets stored. She's running the whole operation. Let's keep going. We should talk about marriage, because marriage in the Norse world was a significant event, an economic and political transaction as much as a personal one. And Viking women's relationship to it was complicated in ways that are interesting to sit with. Marriages in the Norse world were typically arranged by the families involved. This was not unusual for the time. Arranged marriages was the norm across virtually every culture in the medieval world. Love was not irrelevant, but it was not the primary consideration. What mattered was the alliance between families, the exchange of property, the consolidation of land, the securing of alliances. The typical process went something like this. A man, or rather, his family, would identify a potential bride. They would approach her family, specifically her father or her close male guardian if her father was dead. Negotiations would begin. These negotiations were about the bride price, called the munder, paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, and the dowry, the heimanfylgja, brought by the bride from her own family. Now here is something worth noting. The dowry in Norse custom was not technically the property of the husband. It belonged to the wife. She brought it into the marriage as her own property, and under Norse law, she retained certain rights over it. If the marriage ended in divorce, and Norse marriages could end in divorce, which we will get to, she was entitled to take her dowry back. This is not nothing. In many other medieval legal traditions, a woman's property became her husband's property at marriage. Full stop. In the Norse tradition, the wife's property remained, at least in principle, somewhat distinct. Her assets were hers. The wedding ceremony itself involved a feast, the exchange of oaths, the transfer of the keys, and the ritual drinking of ale together. The couple would share a horn of ale in front of witnesses, sealing the bond. There would be toasts to the gods, particularly to Frigg and to Thor, who was associated with weddings and fertility, as well as thunder and hammers. There would be feasting that could last for several days. There would be, presumably, a great deal of exhaustion at the end of it. The legal minimum age for marriage varied, but was generally quite young by modern standards. Girls could be married as young as 12 or 13 in some traditions, though it appears that marriages of very young girls were not always immediately consummated. There was sometimes an understanding that the girl would remain with her parents for a period before going to live with her husband. How consistently this was observed is impossible to know. By their mid-teens, a Norse woman would typically be considered an adult and ready for marriage. By their 20s, they were often already mothers, several times over. The biological clock in the Viking world ticked loudly and fast, partly because life expectancy was not long, and partly because the work of producing the next generation was simply assumed to begin early. Now, I want to be careful here not to present this as either entirely grim or naively rosy. It was complicated. Some women married men they liked, perhaps even loved, and had decent lives within the constraints of their society. Some women were married to men who were unkind, controlling, or violent, and had very little recourse. Most women probably had lives somewhere in the middle, acceptable in some ways, difficult in others, with moments of genuine warmth and satisfaction alongside real hardship. What the Norse legal tradition did offer, unusually for its time and place, was the possibility of divorce. Divorce. In the Viking world, yes, a Norse woman could initiate divorce. This was not common in the medieval world. This was, in many contemporary cultures, completely unthinkable. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble, permanent, ordained by God. You did not divorce, you endured. In the Norse world, marriage was a legal contract, and legal contracts could, under certain circumstances, be dissolved. The reasons a woman could initiate divorce in Norse law were specific and codified. She could divorce her husband if he failed to provide for the household, if he was chronically ill and could not fulfill marital duties, if he wore effeminate clothing, which is an interesting one, suggesting some anxiety about gender presentation in the period, if he was repeatedly violent toward her, though the threshold here was not exactly low by modern standards, if he abandoned the household. To initiate divorce, a woman had to declare her intention publicly, at the bedroom door, at the front door of the Longhouse, and before witnesses at a local assembly. 3 public declarations witnessed, and the divorce was legally in effect. She would take back her dowry. The children were divided. Typically, sons went with the father, daughters with the mother, though arrangements could vary. This is remarkable. Not modern, not feminist in any contemporary sense, but remarkable in its historical context. The fact that a legal mechanism existed at all by which a woman could end an unsatisfactory marriage was unusual enough to note and to hold on to. And the sagas do contain examples of women who actually used it. Women who stood up at the door of the Longhouse and announced clearly and publicly that they were done, that the marriage was over, that they were leaving. We'll meet some of those women a little later in our story tonight. For now, let's think about the household as it actually functioned day to day. Because a large Norse household was not just a nuclear family. It was a complex social unit that could include extended family members, slaves, hired workers, and guests. The husfreyja managed all of this. She organized the labor. She assigned tasks. She maintained the social hierarchy of the household. Who ate what, who sat where, how guests were received, how disputes were managed. She was, in a very real sense, the chief executive of a small enterprise that happened to also be her home. Hospitality was an enormous social obligation in the Norse world. You were expected to feed and house travelers and guests, sometimes for days, and the quality of your hospitality reflected directly on your social standing. A household that could offer good food, good ale, warm shelter, and gracious welcome was a household of status. A household that failed in these things was a household of shame. And who was responsible for the quality of the hospitality? The husfreyja. She planned the meals, she managed the stores. She saw that the guest quarters were prepared, that the mead horn was filled, that the table was set. The honor of the household, which in the Norse world was not a metaphor but a real, tangible, socially consequential thing, rested significantly in her hands. This is another way of saying that women held real social power, not political power in the sense of sitting on councils or making military decisions, but social power, the power to define the quality and character of the household's standing in the community. And in a world where reputations was everything, that was not a small thing. We are settling in now. The night is long and the world outside is very far away. In a longhouse somewhere in 9th century Norway, a woman is checking the stores by lamplight, counting what is left of the grain, calculating how many more weeks until the first spring growth, deciding whether they can afford to be generous with the visitors who arrived at dusk, or whether they need to be careful. She makes the calculation. She decides. She goes back to the fire. And somewhere outside, the wind is moving across a landscape that has barely changed in 1,000 years. Let's keep going. We've talked about the domestic world, the keys, the loom, the hearth, the ale. Now let's drift into something a little different, because Norse women were not only housewives, not even close. There were women in the Norse world who occupied roles that were genuinely unusual, genuinely powerful and genuinely strange by any historical standard. Let's start with the Velva. The Velva was a seeress, a prophetess, a woman who practiced a form of magic and divination called Seidr, and she was one of the most fascinating figures in the entire Norse world. The word Velva literally means something like staff carrier, from Völlr, a staff or wand. The staff was her symbol, her tool, her mark of identity. And the Velva was a woman who wandered. She moved from settlement to settlement, from household to household, invited in by families who needed her services, because the vulva could see things, or she was believed to be able to see things, the future, the hidden, the fates of individuals and communities. She could communicate with spirits. She could influence events through her magical practice. She was simultaneously revered and feared. The practice of Seidr involved the vulva entering a trance state. This was facilitated by singing the high-pitched chanting songs called Varðlokkr, which were performed by the women present at the ceremony to help the vulva achieve the altered state of consciousness necessary for her work. She would sit on a raised platform or chair, elevated above the others, and sink into the trance. Then she would speak, and what she said was taken very seriously. We have a wonderful description of a vulva at work in one of the Icelandic sagas, specifically in Seirik's Saga Röða, the saga of Eric the Red. The setting is Greenland, sometime in the early 11th century. A community is suffering, the harvests have been poor, the outlook is bleak, and a vulva arrives. Her name is Thorbjörg, and the saga describes her appearance in detail. She wore a cloak decorated with stones and a hood lined with white cat fur. She had a staff decorated with brass and stones. Her belt had a bag in which she kept the tools of her magic. She wore calfskin shoes with long laces ending in brass knobs. She wore cat skin gloves, white inside. She was a woman of power and presence, dressed to make that power visible. At the feast held in her honor, she ate the hearts of various animals. She asked if there was a woman who knew the Varðlokkr songs needed to help her trance work, and a woman named Guðríður, who happened to have been taught the songs by her foster mother, and felt somewhat awkward about performing them in front of a Christian community, because it was the era of early Christianity, and these things were complicated. Guðríður sang the songs, beautifully, apparently, and the Velva went into her trance and spoke prophecies about the coming season, about individual futures, about the prospects of the community, and the people listened, and they felt better, and the season did in fact turn out well. Now, how much of this is literal, and how much is performance and psychology, is a question that historians and anthropologists enjoy debating, and we're not going to settle it tonight. What matters for our purposes is what the vulva's existence tells us about the place of women in the Norse spiritual world. Seidr was considered a feminine practice. It was associated with Freyja, the goddess of fertility and magic, who was said to have taught the art to Odin himself. And there is something interesting there. Odin, the Allfather, the king of the gods, one of the most powerful figures in the Norse pantheon, learned magic from a woman. That's the mythology. That's the story they told themselves. Men who practiced Seidr were looked at askance. There was a concept called ergi, a term of shame associated with passivity, unmanliness, and taking the receptive role in various senses. Men who practiced Seidr were associated with ergi because the practice was feminine, and performing feminine things as a man was considered a kind of social violation. Women who practiced Seidr, on the other hand, were simply doing what women did, what the powerful ones among them did. There was nothing shameful about it for them. The vulva was not quite like anyone else in Norse society. She was both inside and outside of it. She traveled alone, or with a small group of attendants, which was itself unusual. Single women moving through the landscape without a male household head was not the norm. She was invited into households and fed and respected. She was paid for her services, and she was also viewed with a kind of wary caution, because someone who could see the future and influence events was someone with genuine power. Not the kind of power you wanted to cross. Let's think about Freyja for a moment, because the goddesses of the Norse pantheon tell us something about how the culture thought about women. Freyja is arguably the most important goddess in Norse mythology, though she is somewhat overshadowed in popular culture by the male gods. She was the goddess of fertility, of love, of beauty, of gold, of war, and of death. Specifically, she got first pick of the fallen warriors, taking half of them to her realm of Folkvanger before Odin got the other half for Valhalla. She was a member of the Vanir, a different clan of gods from Odin's Aesir, who came to live among the Aesir as part of a peace agreement. Freyja was associated with cats. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, which is both delightful and practically unmanageable. She had a cloak of falcon feathers that allowed the wearer to transform into a falcon and fly. She wept tears of gold when she was sad, which sounds beautiful and also quite inconvenient. She was married to a god named Other who mysteriously disappeared, and she searched for him constantly, weeping as she went. She was also the goddess of Seidr, the first practitioner, the one who brought the art into the world. And she was not a passive, gentle goddess. She was a goddess with desires, with agency, with her own agenda. The myths about Freyja show her bargaining, negotiating, sometimes being taken advantage of, sometimes very much taking advantage of others. She was complex. She was fully realized as a character in ways that the goddesses of some other pantheons were not. Frigg, Odin's wife, was another central goddess. She was associated with marriage, motherhood, and weaving. Specifically, she was said to know the fates of all beings, though she kept what she knew to herself. She knew what would happen, and she didn't tell anyone. There's something almost grimly relatable about that. Knowing exactly how things are going to turn out and just carrying that information around. Frigg and Freyja are sometimes confused, sometimes considered to be aspects of the same goddess, sometimes treated as distinct. The scholarship goes back and forth on this, and we don't need to resolve it tonight. What matters is that both were powerful, central, complex feminine presences in the Norse religious imagination. Let's drift from the divine to the legendary. Because Norse literature is full of remarkable women who walk the line between history and myth in ways that are genuinely difficult to untangle. The Shieldmaidens. Oh, the Shieldmaidens. Now, the Shieldmaiden, the Skjaldmare in Old Norse, is one of those figures that has had a spectacular career in popular culture. She appears in novels and television shows and video games. She is fierce and tall and wears leather armor and swings a sword with casual competence. She is, in many of these representations, basically a modern woman transplanted into the Viking world with a weapon and a flowing braid. The historical reality is messier, as historical reality tends to be. The literary evidence for Shieldmaidens is real. They appear in sagas, in skaldic poetry, in mythological texts. Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish chronicler writing around 1200, describes women warriors explicitly, the most famous being Lagertha, who is said to have fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, which is a name you've heard, even if you're not sure where. She is a shield maiden who becomes a chiefess, who divorces Ragnar and raises her own forces and fights her own battles. But Saxo was writing centuries after the period he was describing, and his accounts are a mix of historical tradition, legend, and his own literary imagination. Lagertha may have been a real person who was later mythologized. She may have been purely legendary. She may have been something in between. What about the archaeological evidence? This is where it gets interesting. and controversial and complicated. In 1878, near the Viking town of Birka in Sweden, a grave was excavated. It was a warrior burial, well equipped with weapons, including a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, a shield, a knife, riding gear, and 2 horses. These were the grave goods of a high-status warrior. The grave had long been assumed to be male, because warrior burials were assumed to be male. In 2017, a team of researchers performed DNA analysis on the remains in what is now known as BA581, and the DNA came back as genetically female. The internet did its thing. Headlines proclaimed the discovery of a real Viking Shieldmaiden. Others were more cautious. The debate that followed was genuinely interesting and involved a lot of archaeologists being quite pointed with each other in academic language. The skeptics raised reasonable questions. Does the presence of weapons in a female grave prove that the individual used those weapons in combat? Could she have been a high-status woman buried with weapons as symbols of status or family heritage, rather than personal use? Was there some other explanation? The researchers who conducted the analysis pushed back. The grave goods were consistent with the burial of a military commander, specifically the chess-like game pieces that might indicate strategic military planning. The body was placed in a position of honor. The weapons were not merely decorative. The debate is ongoing, but BG581 is not the only female warrior burial from the Viking world. There are others. Not many warrior burials are dominated by men, as you'd expect from a society where warfare was primarily a male activity. But the existence of some female warrior burials suggests that the Shieldmaiden was not purely fictional. That some women, in some circumstances, took up arms and fought. Perhaps not in the systematic, organized way the Sasas sometimes suggest. Perhaps not as common soldiers in raiding parties. But perhaps as leaders in emergencies, as protectors of their homesteads when the men were gone, as women who, in particular circumstances, picked up a weapon and used it. There's a concept in the Norse world called the Skildborg, the shield wall, which was the primary military formation. Interlocking shields, standing shoulder to shoulder, advancing together. It required discipline, strength, and training. It was not something you walked into without preparation. But there are accounts, mostly from chronicles written by outsiders like Byzantine and Arab writers who encountered Norse raiders and traders, of women fighting alongside men in desperate circumstances. When ships were boarded, when settlements were besieged. The implication is that in a situation of genuine emergency, the women would fight because the alternative was worse. We'll probably never know exactly how common this was. The sources are too sparse and too complicated, by literary convention, to give us numbers or percentages. But the image of the Viking woman as entirely domestic, entirely passive, entirely confined to the Longhouse, that image doesn't hold up under examination. She might have been holding the keys and managing the household most of the time. But she was also, apparently, prepared to put the keys down and pick something else up if it came to that, which is, in its own quiet way, worth knowing. Let's talk about women in the spirit world a bit more, because we've only scratched the surface. There were women in the Norse world who occupied a specific liminal space, not quite goddesses, not quite ordinary humans. The Nornir, or Norns, were 3 beings who controlled fate. They sat beneath the world tree, Yggdrasils, spinning and cutting the threads of destiny. Their names were Urther, that which has become the past, Verðandi, that which is becoming, the present, and Skuld, that which shall be, the future. They were female, weavers, working with thread and spindle. Look at that. Even the cosmic controllers of fate were doing textile work. The spinning and weaving done by mortal women in their longhouses echoed the spinning and weaving of the Norns at the base of the world tree. The work was not just labor. It was participation in something much larger. The thread on your spindle was the thread of fate. Whether Norse women consciously thought of it this way, whether a woman sitting by her hearth spinning wool thought of herself as echoing the work of the Norns, we can't say. But the symbolism was there, embedded in the culture, in the mythology, in the objects. The spindle was sacred. The loom was sacred. The woman who worked them was doing something that connected her to the deepest structures of the Norse cosmos. The Disir were another category of female supernatural beings in Norse tradition. They were ancestral spirits, the female dead of a family, who continued to have power over and interest in the living members of their line. The Disir could protect or they could harm. They needed to be placated, honored, kept on your side. There were festivals dedicated to the Disir. The Disablot, a ritual feast and sacrifice held in late autumn or in early spring, depending on the region. This was a ceremony primarily presided over by women. The sacrifice was made to the female ancestors. The meal was shared with them. Their continued goodwill was sought. This gave women, again, a specific spiritual role that men did not have access to in the same way. The living women of the household maintained the relationship with the dead women of the household. It was a female chain of continuity, stretching back through generations. Your grandmother's grandmother was watching, and she needed to be fed. There were also women called spekona, or spa-mother, terms for various types of seers and wise women that overlapped with, but were not identical to the Velva. Women who could read omens. Women who knew the herbs and their uses, both medicinal and magical. Women who knew the old stories, the old songs, the old ways of doing things. These women were woven into the social fabric of every community. They might not have traveled like the Velva, or performed elaborate ceremonies, but they were the ones you went to when your child was sick and you didn't know why. When your cow had stopped giving milk. When you needed to know whether this was a good day to begin a journey or a bad one. When you wanted to know what your dream had meant. They were repositories of knowledge, practical, spiritual, traditional knowledge that was passed down from woman to woman, not written down because the Norse world was primarily oral. Held in memory, transmitted through relationships. This kind of knowledge is hard to see in the historical record, precisely because it wasn't written down. But it was real, and it was valued, and the women who held it had a kind of quiet, pervasive influence that shows up only in glimpses in the sources. Let's settle into that for a moment. You can almost picture her, the wise woman of the settlement, not dramatic or theatrical like the Velva, just someone who knew things, who had been watching and remembering for 50 or 60 years in a world where 50 or 60 was a long life, who remembered what grew where, what worked for a cough, what the signs meant when the birds flew in a certain direction, what the old stories said about this kind of weather. She probably wasn't glamorous. She probably had rough hands and a practical mind. She probably would have found the Hollywood version of herself quite puzzling. But everyone knew where she lived, and everyone, sooner or later, went to her. The night is very quiet now. Let's keep drifting. We've talked about the spiritual women, the domestic women, the possible warrior women. Now let's talk about something a little more intimate. Love. Marriage from the inside. Grief. The emotional world of Norse women as we can access it through the literature and the archaeology. Because the Icelandic sagas, those remarkable prose narratives composed in the 12th and 13th centuries, but depicting events from the 9th through 11th, give us something that most historical sources don't. They give us women with interior lives. Women who feel things, who think things, who make decisions based on emotions as well as practicality. Now, The sagas are not straightforward historical documents. They are literary works. They were written down centuries after the events they describe. They reflect the concerns and conventions of the period in which they were written as much as the period they describe. Their female characters are partly historical, partly legendary, partly literary constructions. But they are also the closest thing we have to stories about real Norse women told in something approaching their own world's terms. And they are full of women who are complicated, sympathetic, sometimes frightening, sometimes heartbreaking. Let's start with Gudrun Swiftsdottir, perhaps the most famous of the saga women. Gudrun appears in Laxdæla Saga, the saga of the people of Laxardal, which is one of the most beloved of the Icelandic family sagas. She is introduced as the most beautiful woman in Iceland at the time of the story, and also the most intelligent. And the saga gives her, relatively early in her narrative, a remarkable scene. Gudrun goes to a man named Gest Oddleifsson, who was known for interpreting dreams, and she tells him 4 dreams she has had. Each dream involves her wearing a headdress or a piece of jewelry, a crooked wimple, a silver ring, a gold helmet studded with gems, and each dream ends with her losing or discarding the item in some way, throwing it away, dropping it in water. Gest interprets the dreams as prophecy. Each dream corresponds to one of 4 marriages she will have, and none of them will end happily. The saga treats this as essentially settled. Gudrun's fate is to love and to lose repeatedly, and the dreams tell her this before it begins. The dreams are accurate. Her first husband is a man she doesn't really love. Her second husband, the Thord, is killed. Her third husband, Bolli, kills her great love, Kjartan, and is then himself killed in revenge. Her fourth husband drowns at sea. At the end of the saga, Gudrun is old, and her son Bolli asks her which man she loved most. And she says, in one of the most famous lines in all of saga literature, that she was worse to the one she loved most. She means Kjartan, the man who was killed by her husband. The implication being that her decision to marry Bolli, or her role in the chain of events that led to Kjartan's death, was shaped by a love she had for Kjartan that she could never act on appropriately. Her cruelest act came from her greatest love. It is a devastating sentence, and it comes from a culture not typically associated with sophisticated emotional literature. Laxdæla Saga is unusual among the Icelandic sagas in that its central consciousness is female. Many scholars have suggested, cautiously, given how little we know about who wrote these texts, that Laxdæla Saga may have had a female author, or at least was written with particular attention to and sympathy for its female characters. Gudrun is not a passive figure. She is proud and willful and politically engaged. She pushes the men around her toward actions that she wants taken. She uses her position as wife, as widow, as mother to influence events. She is not always admirable. Her cruelty to Kjartan, her cold management of her husband's actions, are presented honestly, not sentimentalized. But she is always fully present, always a person with her own agenda and her own grief. The saga ends with her as an old woman, a Christian. The story's later sections take place after Iceland's conversion to Christianity around 1000 CE. A woman who has spent decades at the local church in prayer and meditation. Her son calls her the greatest woman in Iceland, and she sits with the weight of everything that has happened. 4 husbands, a love she lost, a violence she caused and suffered. She said she was worse to the one she loved most. And then she doesn't explain further. Let's move to another saga woman, Odd the Deep-Minded. Odd, sometimes called Un, appears in several sagas as one of the great founding figures of Iceland. She was a woman of extraordinary accomplishment and, possibly, an extraordinary real historical person, though as always the line between history and legend is blurry. Her story goes something like this. Aud was the daughter of a Norwegian chieftain named Ketil Flatnose, who had settled in the Hebrides off the coast of Scotland. She married a king of Dublin. This is the Viking world, where Scandinavians were very much in Ireland and Scotland, and had a son named Thorstein the Red, who carved out a kingdom in northern Scotland before being killed in battle. When Thorstein died, Aud found herself a widow in a foreign land. She was, apparently, in her 60s or thereabouts. And rather than giving up or depending on someone else, she did something remarkable. She had a ship built secretly in the forest. She gathered her family and her people and a substantial number of slaves. And she sailed first to the Orkney Islands, where she arranged the marriages of several of her granddaughters. Then to the Faroe Islands, where she arranged more marriages. Then to Iceland, which was then recently settled and still had good land available. In Iceland, she claimed a large tract of land in the Delir region of western Iceland and established a settlement. She freed her slaves, which was unusual and worthy of remark, and gave them land of their own. She was apparently one of the very few Norse women to claim lands as a settler in her own right, rather than as part of a male household. And then she died. Her burial, as described in the sagas, was lavish, and specifically her own. She was buried in a ship, as a great chieftain would be, upright, dressed in her finest clothes. She had requested a burial consistent with her status as a leader, and she received it. There is something almost cinematic about Aud. In her 60s, having lost her father, her husband, and her son, building a ship in secret and sailing across the North Atlantic to start again. Not from desperation, apparently, but from determination. From the sense that there was still something to build, still somewhere to go. The sagas love her. They present her as a figure of exceptional dignity and capability, and even allowing for the literary embellishment, the basic outlines of a woman who was a founding settler of Iceland, who freed her slaves, who was given a ship burial. Those outlines seem to rest on something real. The sagas also give us women of great intensity. Women whose grief or fury drives the narrative in ways that are quite different from the passive mourning figure conventional in many medieval literary traditions. Consider the figure of Hildegunr in Njál's saga, perhaps the most complex and morally ambitious of all the Icelandic sagas. Hildegunnr's husband is killed, and she keeps his blood-soaked cloak. When her uncle Flosi comes to visit, she brings out the cloak and throws it over him, commanding him to avenge the death. The blood drips onto his face. The act is deliberately provocative, designed to shame him into action, because in the Norse world, if you didn't avenge a killed kinsman, you were shamed. And Hildegunr uses that cultural mechanism with precise, cold deliberation. She wants blood. She gets it, in the end, though in Njál's saga, every act of vengeance generates another cycle of revenge, and the consequences spiral out terribly for everyone involved. Hildegunnr's moment at the beginning of the feud is a single stone pushed from the top of a long, steep hill. What's striking about how the saga treats her is that she is not condemned for this. She is presented as acting within the logic of her world. The code of vengeance was not metaphorical. It was a genuine obligation, and she discharged that obligation with a very particular kind of determination. The women of the sagas grieve, and their grief is not quiet or private. It is public, voiced, occasionally terrifying. There is a form in Old Norse poetry called the grátur, the formal lament over the dead. Women performed these laments. They were expected to be the mourners, the keeners, the voices of grief at the funeral and in the immediate aftermath. This was a socially sanctioned role. The woman who wailed and lamented was doing something appropriate and necessary, giving voice to the community's loss. But beyond the formal lament, the sagas show women whose grief is transformative, who come out of mourning as different people, who take the energy of their loss and direct it toward action, sometimes toward revenge, sometimes toward political maneuvering, sometimes toward a kind of fierce pragmatic rebuilding. The woman who buries her husband and then turns around and manages the farm, negotiates with creditors, arranges her children's futures, holds the household together. This figure appears again and again in the sagas. Not celebrated in grand heroic terms, but simply present. The one who keeps going when the keeping going is all there is. The emotional world of Norse women was also shaped by the religion and mythology they lived inside. And the Norse mythology is not a cheerful mythology. It is a mythology haunted by doom. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the great ending, hangs over the entire Norse cosmological world. The gods know it is coming. Odin knows his fate, to be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir at the end. Thor knows his fate, to kill the Midgard serpent and then die from its poison. The world tree will shake, the sea will rise, the sky will fall, and yet the gods continue. They feast in Valhalla, they hold their councils, they fight their battles, they maintain the world even knowing it will end. There is something in this cosmology, this combination of doom and persistence, that resonates with a people living in a genuinely harsh environment where many things could kill you and the winter was very long. The women in this mythology face the same doom. The goddesses know Ragnarok is coming. Frigg knows the fate of her son Balder before he dies. She extracts oaths from everything in creation, every plant, every animal, every stone, every metal, to not harm him. But she overlooks the mistletoe. And Loki uses a sprig of mistletoe to kill Balder, because of course he does, and the whole precaution unravels from the one small gap. The image of Frigg going around the world asking everything to take an oath not to harm her child is so unbearably maternal. She does everything she can. She is thorough and determined and clever. And it still doesn't work. Because there is always the thing you didn't think of. Always the mistletoe. We should talk about death. Specifically, we should talk about how Viking women died and how they were buried. Because the archaeological record of burials tells us a great deal about how the living thought about the women in their community. Burial practices varied by time and place. But in the Viking Age, the most common form was cremation or inhumation. Burial in a mound or barrow, often with grave goods. The grave goods buried with a person reflected their identity, their status, their role in life. Women's graves from the Viking Age contain, as you might expect, objects associated with the domestic and social roles they occupied. Spindle whorls, the weights from drops, spindles, are extremely common in women's burials. Combs, often made of antler. Beads, which were clearly highly valued. Glass beads were luxury items, often imported from considerable distances. Brooches, the oval brooches that held the Norse woman's outer garment at the shoulders, are one of the most characteristic grave goods of the period. Keys, as we mentioned. Small knives. Personal items. But also sometimes unexpected things. Weapons, as we've discussed. Boats. In a few cases, absolutely extraordinary material. The most famous female burial from the Viking world is the Oseberg ship burial, found in Norway and dated to around 834 CE. 2 women were buried in a great ship, a beautifully decorated vessel that was clearly of enormous quality and value. The ship was packed with grave goods, textiles of astonishing complexity and quality, tapestries that show scenes of ritual and daily life, beds, a cart, kitchen equipment, animal sacrifices, personal items. It was one of the richest burials ever found from the Viking world, and it contained 2 women. Who were they? We don't know for certain. One was older, perhaps in her 80s. One was younger, perhaps in her 50s. The older woman has been suggested to be a queen or a high-status noblewoman. She may have been the vulva of her community. Some of the objects buried with her, including a staff and certain botanical items, are consistent with the material culture of the Setther practitioner. But honestly, we don't know. Two women buried together in a great ship with fabulous wealth around them. That's what we have. The rest is interpretation and imagination. The Oseberg textiles deserve a moment of their own because they are extraordinary. Among the grave goods were fragments of tapestries that, when reconstructed, show scenes of considerable narrative complexity. Women in processions, ritual scenes, wagons, horses, riders. These textiles were not simple domestic cloth. They were sophisticated, skilled artwork, and they were the work of women. The quality of the weaving, the thinness of the thread, the complexity of the patterns, the sophistication of the design indicates weavers of exceptional skill working at the highest level of their craft. These were not beginners making rough cloth for everyday use. These were master craftswomen producing objects of beauty and meaning. And they are buried with the women who owned or perhaps created them. This is the world they occupied. This is the wealth they produced. This is what we have left of them. A fragment of tapestry, a spindle whorl, a pair of oval brooches, not nothing. Let me pause here and just say something simple. We are now about halfway through our evening together. You've traveled a long way from the modern world, through the longhouses and the looms and the ale vats and the grave mounds, through the vulva and the Shieldmaiden and Gudrun and Odd, through the Oseberg ship and the Norns at the base of the world tree. If you're still awake, you're braver than most. And if you're drifting, if the Longhouse and the Spindle and the faraway fjords are blending with whatever your room looks like in the dark, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's keep going anyway. The story isn't finished. We've been spending time inside the Longhouse, at the hearth, with the loom and the keys. Now let's step outside. Because Norse women were not always confined to the domestic sphere, and the world they sometimes moved through was considerably wider than a single farm in Norway. The Viking Age was, among other things, an age of extraordinary mobility. Norse people moved. They traded, they raided, they settled, they explored. They went to Iceland and Greenland and Newfoundland in the west. They went to Russia and Constantinople and Baghdad in the east. They established towns and markets and trade networks that stretched from the North Sea to the Caspian Sea. And women traveled with them. Not always, not as frequently as men. But women were present in Norse settlements across the diaspora, and the archaeological evidence confirms it. DNA studies of early Icelandic settlers show that a substantial percentage of the female population came from the British Isles, Ireland and Scotland specifically. Some of these women may have been brought as slaves. Some may have been voluntary settlers. Some may have been the wives and daughters of Norsemen who had settled in the British Isles and then moved on to Iceland. But women were there, in the first boats to Iceland, in the settlements of Greenland, and at Lance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, the Norse site in North America. The archaeological finds include what appears to be a spindle whorl, which means there was a woman there, spinning wool, at the edge of a continent Europeans would not officially know about for another 4 centuries. Just sitting there, doing her spinning. At the end of the world, we know the name of one Norse woman who was certainly in North America. Her name was Gudridr Thorbjörnardóttir, Gudrid Thorbjörnardóttir, and she is one of the most remarkable women in medieval history, though she remains relatively unknown outside of Norse studies. Gudrid's life story, as preserved in 2 different sagas, Eiríksrik Saga Retha and Grenlandinga Saga, is one of extraordinary range. She was born in Iceland, was taken to Greenland as a young woman, survived shipwreck and plague, traveled to Vinland, North America, as part of the Norse expedition there, gave birth to a son named Snorri in Vinland, making her son the first European child known to be born in the Americas, and then returned to Greenland, then to Iceland, and then sailed to Rome, all the way to Rome on a pilgrimage, and then came back to Iceland, where she spent the rest of her life as a nun of sorts, in a small hermitage near the farm of her descendants. Iceland to Greenland to North America to Greenland to Iceland to Rome to Iceland, in the early 11th century, without GPS. She was also, you will recall, the woman who sang the Vardlakr songs for the Völva Thorbjörg in the scene we described earlier, the singing that helped the seeress achieve her trance. So she was both a participant in traditional Norse spiritual practice and, by the end of her life, a devout Christian. The two coexisted in her life as they coexisted in the society of the time, awkwardly, not always comfortably, but somehow managing. Gudrid is a figure who deserves far more popular recognition than she has. Her life encompassed a geographical range that was extraordinary by any standard, and her personality, as portrayed in the sagas, is warm and capable and adaptable. Someone who survived genuinely terrible things and kept moving forward. Let's talk about women in trade, because the Viking world was very much a commercial world and women participated in it. Norse women were producers of goods that had economic value. Cloth, as we've discussed, was a commodity. So was ale. So were the dairy products, butter and cheese and skyr that women produced. So were the prepared and preserved foods. Women's labor produced material wealth that entered the trade economy. Women could also be traders themselves. There is evidence, admittedly sparse, of women participating in markets. The great trading towns of the Viking Age, Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang, Dublin, were mixed settlements with both male and female populations. And it would be surprising if women were entirely absent from commercial exchange. The Arab traveler and diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Volga Vikings called the Rus on his journey through Russia around 922 CE, left an account that is one of our richest sources on Viking customs. He describes the women wearing neck rings, silver or gold rings hung around the neck, each ring representing a specific monetary value. This was wearable wealth, accessible wealth, wealth that the woman carried on her body and controlled. The imagery of women wearing their wealth around their necks is striking. It's a form of financial independence, portable assets that were specifically associated with women. When you see the elaborate neck rings found in Norse women's burials, they're not just jewelry, they're bank accounts. Women who participated in trade might also have had access to weights and scales, the tools of commercial measurement. There are women's graves that contain small sets of weights, which suggests these women were weighing silver, measuring out payment, engaging in commercial transactions. Not as merchants in some grand sense, but as participants in the everyday economy of exchange. Let's think about women in the Norse diaspora more broadly, in the settlements and communities that sprang up across the Viking world. In Ireland and Scotland, Norse settlers established towns. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick in Ireland, various settlements in the Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland. These were communities that mixed Norse and local populations over time. The women in these communities were a blend. Norse women who came with the settlers, local women who married into Norse families, the children of these mixed unions. The Norse women who settled in Ireland were entering a world with a very different culture, Irish, Christian, with its own deeply ingrained social norms. The interaction between these cultures was complex. Norse women brought their own traditions, their own forms of burial, their own jewelry styles, their own domestic practices. Over time, these blended with local practices in ways that we can see in the archaeological record, in the hybrid styles of metalwork and the mixed burial traditions from these communities. In Iceland, Norse women were the mothers of an entire new culture. Iceland had no indigenous population. It was empty when the Norse arrived, except for a small number of Irish monks who had settled there earlier and mostly left when the Norse showed up. So the Icelandic population was built from scratch by the settlers, and the women among them were the literal biological and cultural foundation of what would become a quite distinctive civilization. Icelandic society, with its remarkable literary tradition, its unique legal and political structures, its saga literature, its particular combination of Norse tradition and Christian influence, was built in large part by women raising children in sod houses on volcanic islands in the North Atlantic, far from anywhere, in conditions of genuine hardship, in a landscape that was beautiful and strange, and occasionally tried to kill them with volcanic eruptions. The women who went to Greenland had it even harder. Greenland, settled by Eric the Red around 985 CE after he was banished from Iceland for manslaughter, because the Viking world was like that, was not actually very green. It was cold and marginal, and the growing season was brutally short. The settlements that were established there survived for about 500 years before disappearing, in a process that is still debated by historians. Climate change, the Black Death reaching even there, conflicts with indigenous populations, the loss of trade protections, possibly all of these at once. But while those settlements existed, women lived in them, raised families there, managed households there, produced cloth and food, and kept the Norse community alive at the very edge of the known world. There's something almost impossibly remote about those Greenlandic farmsteads. Small clusters of stone and turf buildings huddled in the relatively sheltered fjords of the west coast, surrounded by an immense and indifferent landscape of ice and rock and sea. And in those buildings, women were spinning wool, checking the food stores, brewing ale, managing the quays, doing exactly what women in Norway or Iceland were doing, but with a much smaller margin for error. If the stores ran out in Greenland, there was nowhere nearby to get more. If the cattle died in a hard winter, you were in serious trouble. The husfreyja of a Greenlandic farm had to be very good at her job, because the consequences of getting it wrong were extreme. Let's slow down here and think about something. All of these women, in Norway, in Iceland, in Ireland, in Greenland, at the edge of North America, were doing largely the same things. Managing households, raising children, producing cloth and food, maintaining the social fabric of their communities, participating in the spiritual life of their world. None of this is glamorous. Very little of it is what we would call exciting. But it is the substance of actual human life, the thing that kept people alive and in communities. The thing that allowed the raids and the trade voyages and the saga heroics to happen in the first place. Because behind every Viking on a longship was a household that someone was managing, a farm that someone was running, children that someone was raising, stores that someone was counting and protecting. The women were not background. They were not support staff for the real story. They were the real story, running parallel to the dramatic bits that tend to get all the attention. And it took place almost entirely in private, in the long, dark interior of the Longhouse, by the light of a lamp burning fish oil, while the wind came in off the fjord. This is a good moment to just rest for a while. The spindle is still. The fire is banked down to coals. Everyone else in the Longhouse is asleep. And somewhere out there, across 1,000 years, all those women are going on about their lives, completely unaware that anyone will ever try to piece together what those lives looked like. Let's keep piecing. We've talked about the domestic world, the spiritual world, the emotional world, the wider world of travel and trade. Now let's turn to something that might be the most surprising aspect of all, the legal and political world. Because Norse women had legal standing that was genuinely unusual for their time. And while their political participation was constrained in many ways, it was not zero. The primary legal assembly in the Norse world was the Thing. The Thing. This was a regular gathering of free men in a given region, at which legal disputes were heard and decided, laws were proclaimed, and political matters were discussed. The Althing, was the General Assembly of all Iceland, established in 930 CE at Thingvellir, a spectacular volcanic plain in the southwest of the island. It met every summer for 2 weeks. These assemblies were dominated by men. The formal participants, the Gothar, who were chieftains with legal authority, were male. The full voting members were male. Women did not hold formal political office in the Norse world as a rule. But women were not entirely absent from the Thing. They could attend. They could speak, in at least some circumstances. They could be represented in legal proceedings, and those proceedings could concern their rights and interests. And crucially, there were women's issues that came before these assemblies regularly. Property disputes, divorce proceedings, cases of assault or sexual violence. The fact that a woman's legal claims had standing, that you could bring a case on behalf of a woman's interests and expect it to be heard and decided, is significant. It didn't mean the system was fair or consistent or that women always won, but it meant they had a recognized place in the legal order of the world. They were not invisible to the law. Let's look at some specific areas where Norse women's legal standing was codified. Property rights. A Norse woman could own property. She could inherit property from her family, typically as a dowry, but also in some circumstances as a direct heir if there were no male heirs. She retained certain rights over her dowry during marriage. She could own property in her own name as a widow. The laws on inheritance varied by region and period, and they generally did favor male heirs. A son would typically inherit before a daughter, but daughters were not entirely cut out, and a woman with no brothers might inherit significantly. The property rights of Norse women were more extensive than in many contemporary Christian legal traditions. Divorce, as we discussed, was available to women under specific circumstances. The woman's right to reclaim her dowry upon divorce was legally protected. This gave women a kind of financial backstop. The knowledge that if the marriage became intolerable, they could leave with their property and not be destitute. Sexual violence was legally recognized as a wrong. A woman who was sexually assaulted had legal recourse. She or her male guardian could bring a case before the Thing and seek compensation. The compensation was financial. This was a legal system based primarily on monetary compensation rather than punishment, and the amounts were set by law. The system was far from perfect, and the emphasis on compensation rather than punishment meant the victim's needs were not necessarily centered in the way we would expect today. But the legal recognition that sexual violence against women was a wrong to be redressed is itself significant. A woman could also bring a defamation case if her sexual reputation was impugned falsely. In a world where reputation was everything, the ability to defend your reputation legally was real protection. The sagas contain numerous scenes set at the Thing, and women appear in them in interesting ways. They are sometimes present at these assemblies. They sometimes speak, not from the law rock where formal speeches were made, but in the margins, in conversations, in the negotiations that happened around the formal proceedings. They also sometimes pull strings from a distance. The sagasa woman who sends her husband or son to the Thing with specific instructions who manages the politics of the case from the Longhouse, who is the strategist even when she is not the public face. This figure is recognizable in the literature, the power behind the seat, as it were. And Jarl's saga is again a rich source for this. The character of Hallgerther, who is a provocative and not entirely sympathetic figure, is nevertheless someone who is deeply embedded in the political maneuvering that drives the saga. Her decisions, including the famous instance where she refuses to save her husband Gunnar's life because of an old slight, are political acts with consequences that ripple through the whole narrative. She is not at the thing, but she is absolutely shaping the events that the thing will deal with. Women as peacemakers is another recurring theme. The formal role of peacemaker in the Norse world was associated with women in specific ways. A woman, especially a highborn woman, might act as an intermediary between feuding families. Her position as someone with connections to both sides, through birth and marriage, gave her a kind of neutrality that could be used to facilitate negotiation. The mead cup is relevant here. At Norse feasts, it was the woman of the house who carried the mead horn around the hall, offering drink to the guests. This was not merely a service function. It was a ritual. The woman moved through the hall, serving the guests in order of rank, creating connection and managing the social dynamics of the gathering. The Beowulf poem, from the Anglo-Saxon tradition but relevant to the Norse world, describes a queen circulating through the hall with the mead cup, addressing each guest individually, managing the social fabric of the feast. The woman with the mead horn could use that role to facilitate conversation, to bring people together, to smooth over tensions. She was the social engineer of the feast, and feasts in the Norse world were occasions for politics as much as for celebration. This peacemaking role was so established that there was a specific poetic kenning for it. Women were called friðuep, which means peace weavers in the Old English tradition, and similar concepts appear in Old Norse. The weaving metaphor again. The woman who weaves peace as she weaves cloth, who creates connection and pattern from disparate threads. Now we should be careful not to romanticize this too much. The peace weaver role could also be exploitative. Women were often used as instruments of alliance making, married off to former enemies to cement a peace, without much consideration for their own wishes. The peace weaver could equally be called the political pawn, depending on your perspective. And the peace didn't always hold. Saga literature is full of women whose peace weaving function failed, who were married to create an alliance between families, and then found themselves in the middle when the alliance broke down, who had children by one man and brothers from another family, and were required to navigate the violence between them. Hildegunnar, whom we discussed earlier, is a kind of anti-peace weaver. She is the woman who uses her position to incite violence rather than prevent it, who takes the blood-soaked cloak and throws it over her uncle, rather than laying it aside and seeking reconciliation. The saga does not entirely condemn her for this. Within the logic of the world she inhabits, she is doing what the code requires. But she is certainly not weaving peace. There were women in the Norse world who exercised political authority directly, if rarely. The concept of the landowning, independent woman, the woman who ran an estate in her own right, as a widow or as someone who had inherited in the absence of male heirs, allowed some women to hold the position of de facto chieftain. They might not be called a jarl. They might not have formal political standing. But if you owned the land and had the loyalty of the people on it and were able to project authority, the formal title mattered less than the practical reality. Freydis Eiríksdóttir, the daughter of Eric the Red and the half-sister of Leif Erikson, is another figure from the Vinland Sagas, and she is, to put it mildly, a complicated character. In the sagas, Freydis appears as a woman of extraordinary force. She participated in the Norse expeditions to North America. In Grönlandinga Saga, during an attack by indigenous peoples, she reportedly picked up a sword from a fallen warrior and, while pregnant, slapped it against her chest to intimidate the attackers, causing them to retreat. This may or may not have happened. It is exactly the kind of detail that embellishes in the telling, but it gives a sense of how she was remembered. In Eirik Saga Röða, Freydis is far darker. She is said to have arranged the killing of an entire family, including women, whom the men refused to kill, and whom she killed herself with an axe, in order to take their ship and goods. This is a shocking act of violence presented in the saga without much ambiguity. She is not a heroine here. She is a villain. What is interesting is that both accounts, the brave woman slapping a sword against her chest, the ruthless woman with an axe, are plausible products of the same personality. A woman of extreme force and self-determination who could direct that force in any direction. Whether Freydis was more one than the other, or both equally, we can't know. She is another Viking woman who slips between history and legend, leaving us with fragments and contradictions. The Althing in Iceland is worth a particular moment of attention, because Iceland's political tradition was in some ways quite distinctive. Iceland had no king. The Althing was not a king's court or a royal council. It was a deliberative assembly of chieftains, the Goðir, who negotiated, argued, and decided matters of law and policy together. It was not a democracy in any modern sense, but it was a relatively decentralized power structure compared to the feudal kingdoms of continental Europe. The settlers of Iceland included women who had, as we've noted, genuine property rights and some degree of legal standing. And while the Althing itself was a male arena, the culture around it, the negotiating, the maneuvering, the building of alliances and settlements, involved women in ways that the formal record doesn't always capture. The famous conversion of Iceland to Christianity in 1000 CE is a case in point. The decision was made at the Althing by the law speaker Þorgeir Ljósvetningagoði, who retired to his booth and lay under his cloak for a day and a night before emerging to announce that Iceland would be Christian. The Christianity he announced was pragmatic and moderate. Old Norse practices were not immediately outlawed, just the public ones. But the process that led to this moment involved a great deal of negotiation and maneuvering, much of which took place in the informal spaces around the assembly, in the booths where families camped, in the conversations over meals, in the family meetings where positions were worked out. Women were present in all of those spaces. Their voices are not recorded in the formal annals. But they were there. Let's pause here. Let's just breathe for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground. We've been inside the Longhouse and outside it. We've talked about spinning and brewing and the Norns and the Volva and the Shieldmaiden and Gudrid at the edge of America and Freydis, with an axe and the peace weavers and the women at the thing. And we're only partway through. Your breath is slowing, probably. The details are washing over you gently. The fjord is very far away and very long ago. That's fine. We're not going anywhere. We've spent most of our time with women in the middle of their lives. Women as wives, as mothers, as household managers, as political actors, as spiritual practitioners. Let's think a little about the full span, about girlhood, about old age, about what a woman's life looked like from beginning to end in the Norse world. Girlhood in the Norse world was a period of learning, primarily. From the moment a girl could hold a spindle, she was learning the skills she would need for adult life. This was not joyless. Children are children, and played and laughed and caused trouble in longhouses, just as they have in every time and place. But the sense that childhood was a protected period of development apart from adult responsibilities is a relatively modern concept. In the Norse world, children were smaller adults, integrated into the work of the household as quickly as their capabilities allowed. Games existed. Archaeologists have found small objects that appear to be toys, tiny figurines, simple carved objects, children's shoes, evidence of play. But the separation between play and work was much less distinct than in modern childhoods. A girl of 6 or 7 might be helping with simpler domestic tasks. At 10 or 11, she might be spinning competently. By her early teens, she might be helping to manage some aspects of household food production or textile work. By her mid-teens, she was approaching marriageable age, and the consideration of her marriage prospects was very much on the minds of her family. The transition from girlhood to womanhood was marked, in a cultural sense, by marriage. The wedding was the formal induction into adult status for a Norse woman. From the moment she received the keys and took her place as husfreyja, she was a woman with responsibilities and a degree of authority. But the transition was also physiological. The Norse world was not oblivious to the female body and its rhythms, though we have limited direct evidence of how they talked about menstruation or puberty, since most of our sources are male-authored texts focused on other things. What we do know is that Norse women's health was a matter of practical concern. Women needed to survive childbirth repeatedly. They needed to be strong enough for the physical demands of the work. They needed to stay well through winters that could be brutal and through the various diseases that circulated in the population. Herbs and their medicinal properties were well known to Norse women. The knowledge of which plant helped with which ailment was practical, empirical knowledge built up over generations. We find evidence of this in the herb gardens associated with settlement sites, in the botanical remains found in contexts associated with women, in the references in the sagas to wise women who knew how to heal. There was also a genuine magical dimension to healing in the Norse world. The idea that illness could have spiritual causes and required spiritual as well as physical intervention. The healer woman occupied a position that combined what we would now distinguish as medicine and magic, because in the Norse worldview they were not separate things. Pregnancy and childbirth were, as we noted early in our evening, genuinely dangerous. But they were also anticipated, prepared for, surrounded by social ritual and community support. The women who attended a birth were not passive bystanders. They were active participants, bringing practical skill and traditional knowledge to bear on a situation that required both. There is some evidence that Norse women used certain herbal preparations during pregnancy and childbirth. Ergot of rye has been suggested as something used to stimulate contractions, though the line between helpful and harmful with ergot is extremely narrow. Various herbs with analgesic or calming properties may have been used. Whether these preparations were helpful or harmful in any given case depended on the knowledge of the woman administering them and the specific circumstances. The mortality rate for mothers in childbirth in the Viking Age was significant. We don't have good numbers. The statistical tools for this kind of historical analysis are imprecise. But comparative data from pre-modern populations suggests that deaths in childbirth were common enough to be a genuine risk that every pregnant woman would have been aware of. You prepared for childbirth knowing that some women did not survive it. The prayers to Frigg were not casual, and infant mortality was high. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age burial sites reveals a significant proportion of child burials, including newborns and very young infants. Many children did not survive their first year. Many more did not reach adulthood, A woman might give birth 5, 6, 7 times and end up with 3 surviving children, or 2, or none. The grief of lost children is present in the Norse sources, if not always front and center. There are mentions in the sagas, brief, understated, in the Norse manner, of children who died, parents who mourned them, mothers who never recovered from the loss. There's a term in Old Norse, barnafall, which means the loss of a child. It appears in genealogical records and saga passages as a kind of technical term, a word that exists because the thing it describes happened often enough to need its own word. Old age. Let's think about old age. If a Norse woman survived girlhood, survived childbirth multiple times, survived the physical demands of a lifetime of heavy work, survived the winters and the diseases and the occasional violence of her world, she might reach what counted as old age, which in the Viking period meant perhaps her late 40s or 50s, though some people clearly lived into their 60s and 70s and beyond. The Oseberg woman appeared to be in her 80s. Old age in the Norse world carried a kind of authority. An old woman who had survived, who had raised children, managed a household, accumulated knowledge and experience, was a figure of respect. The wise old woman, the grandmother who remembered things nobody else knew, was a recognized and valued presence. The Volva was often depicted as old. Thorbjörg in the Greenland saga is clearly a mature woman. Age and wisdom and the ability to see were connected. A young woman might have beauty and vitality, but an old woman had knowledge. And knowledge, in a world without books, was precious. An old woman might also be free, in certain ways, from the constraints that had governed her earlier life. If her husband was dead and her children were grown, she might have considerable autonomy. The freedom to make her own decisions, to manage her own property, to speak her mind in ways that younger women could not. The postmenopausal woman who had fulfilled her reproductive role was, in a sense, released from some of the most pressing social expectations. There is also in the Norse world a concept, not unique to it, but particularly visible here, of the old woman as a keeper of memory, as the repository of genealogy, tradition, the stories of ancestor. In an oral culture, the transmission of history and tradition depends entirely on human memory and the willingness to pass on what you know. Women were central to this transmission. They told the old stories to their children. They preserved the genealogies, who was descended from whom, what alliances had existed, what debts and honors and enmities stretched back through the generations. This oral transmission is hard to see directly because it was not written down at the time. But when the sagas were eventually written down, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the raw material they worked from was the oral tradition, the stories that had been told and retold for generations. And it seems likely that women were significant carriers of that tradition. The grandmother who sat by the fire and told the old stories. The mother who explained who your ancestors were and what they had done. The wise woman who remembered what the law had said about this particular kind of dispute 40 years ago. These were the living archives of the Norse world, invisible to most of our sources, essential to everything. Death, when it came, was prepared for. Norse attitudes toward death are complicated and not easily summarized. The mythology gives us Valhalla, the great hall where warriors who died in battle feasted and trained forever, awaiting Ragnarok. Hell, the realm of the dead, ruled by a figure named Hel, who was half living and half dead, was where most people went, not a punishment, simply a destination, a place of shadows. The idea that a good death, a death in battle, a death with your boots on, a death with your weapons in your hand, was preferable to dying in bed is associated with the Norse world, particularly with the male warrior ideal. But for women, who did not typically die in battle, The paths to a good death were different. A woman who had lived well, who had managed her household with skill, raised her children, been a good husfreyja, been generous to guests, been wise and capable, could expect to be mourned properly and buried with her due. Her grave goods would reflect her status. Her family would perform the rituals. She would be, in a sense, properly sent off. The lavishness of female burials in the Viking Age, the Osberg ship, the various high-status women's graves with their jewelry and textiles and keys reflects a genuine respect for what these women represented. Their achievements, humble by the standards of military glory but essential by the standards of actual survival, were acknowledged in how they were buried. The keys went into the grave. You were what you had managed. Let's now move into the later Viking Age and think about something that changed everything for Norse women as much as for anyone else in the Norse world: Christianity. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity happened gradually, and not all at once, over the course of roughly the 9th through 11th centuries. It was different in different places. Norway converted relatively early through the campaigns of kings like Olaf Haraldsson. Sweden came later. Iceland's conversion in 1000 CE was famous. Denmark was among the earlier converts under Harald Bluetooth in the mid-10th century. And as it came in, Christianity changed things. Not immediately, not all at once, and not without considerable blending and negotiation with the existing Norse traditions. But it changed things. For women, the changes were mixed. On one hand, Christianity brought certain ideas about women that were, frankly, not improvements on what came before. The Christian tradition in this period had a complex and often ambivalent relationship with women, rooted in theological ideas about Eve and the fall, about female sexuality as dangerous, about women as spiritually weaker and in need of male guidance. The Church's emphasis on male authority in the household and in public life was, if anything, more systematic and ideologically grounded than the practical male authority of Norse custom. The Church also opposed divorce. Where Norse women had the legal ability to exit bad marriages, Christian doctrine said marriage was a sacrament and permanent. As Christianity took hold in Scandinavia, the divorce options that Norse custom had provided gradually narrowed and eventually disappeared for most practical purposes. The magic and spiritual practices associated with women, the seidr, the vulva's work, the herbal knowledge blended with spiritual practice, were increasingly framed as pagan, diabolical, dangerous. Not immediately suppressed, because these changes take time, but gradually pushed to the margins and eventually criminalized. On the other hand, Christianity brought the convent, and the convent was, for some women, a genuinely interesting alternative. The religious life in the Norse Christian world offered women a path that was not defined entirely by marriage and motherhood. A woman who entered a convent could pursue learning. The monasteries and convents were the primary sites of literacy and intellectual life in medieval Europe. She could build a career, in a sense, as a religious professional. She could hold authority. Abbesses wielded considerable power within their institutions and sometimes well beyond them. The very wealthy could found convents, which gave high-born women significant patronage power and a kind of legacy that was different from the legacy of a good marriage. And within the convent, women could write, could read, could engage with theological ideas, could create art. This is not available to most women. Most Norse women continued to marry and manage households and spin wool. But the convent represents a new option that hadn't existed in the pre-Christian Norse world. A place for the woman who did not fit neatly into the husfreyja role. Gudrid, who ended her extraordinary life as a kind of solitary religious, was perhaps an early version of this. someone who had lived all the things the world had to offer and then retreated into a quieter, more contemplative space. The Christianity she found didn't erase the Sather songs she had sung in Greenland, or the voyage to America, or the sun born at the edge of the world. It just gave her somewhere to put it all, in the end. The Christianization of Scandinavia also changed burial practices. Christian burial meant simple inhumation, body in the ground, oriented east-west in a churchyard. No grave goods, no ship, no weapons. No keys, no spindle whorls or jewelry or oval brooches. The material wealth of the pagan burial disappeared, which means the archaeological record, after conversion, becomes much less informative about individual women. We lose the keys and the beads and the loom weights. We lose the material language through which Norse women had been communicating their identity and status. This is a genuine loss, not just for archaeologists, but for the historical narrative. The graves of pagan Norse women are rich documents. The graves of Christian Norse women are almost empty. But the women were still there, still spinning, still brewing, still managing the household. The conversion changed the cosmology and the burial rites. It didn't change the work. We are deep into the night now. The Norse world is starting to feel like something you've always known, in a distant way. The Longhouse, the fjord, the smell of wool and wood smoke. The woman checking her stores by lamplight, the vulva going into her trance, Gudrid singing the old songs in Greenland, Odd building her ship in secret. Let's keep going. We're not done. Let's turn to the ground, because beyond the sagas and the law codes and the chronicles, we have something more direct, the physical objects that Norse women left behind, the things they made and used and wore and were buried with. The archaeology of Viking women is a rich and growing field, and it tells us things that texts simply cannot. We've already mentioned the Oseberg ship burial, which is the grand dame of Viking age female burials. Let's spend a bit more time there. The Oseberg ship was excavated in 1904 from a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway. The ship itself, a beautifully crafted Norse longship about 22 meters long, had been used as a burial vessel. The burial mound was constructed over it, sealing everything inside. The conditions of preservation were not perfect. The ship had been robbed at some point in antiquity, and the organic materials had decomposed unevenly. But what survived was extraordinary. The two women were placed in a specially constructed burial chamber in the stern of the ship. Around them were the goods they would need: textiles, bedding, kitchen equipment, a bucket of wild apples, a small canister that probably contained food. Animals had been sacrificed: horses, oxen, dogs, a cat. These were not token sacrifices but substantial ones, reflecting the importance of the burial. The textiles found at Oseberg are, even in their fragmentary state, remarkable. There are pieces of tapestry that show complex narrative scenes. There are fragments of high-quality woven cloth in various patterns. There are examples of tablet weaving, a specialized technique that produces narrow, complex bands of pattern that show a very high level of skill. These textiles took a lifetime to master, and whoever made them was a master. The cart found at Oseberg, a large, heavily decorated wooden cart, is unique in the archaeological record. It is carved with elaborate scenes, including a narrative scene involving multiple figures. The carving is sophisticated and beautiful. Who made it? We don't know. A craftsman, probably. But it was buried with these women, which suggests it belonged to them, or was associated with their world. Outside of the Oseberg, the pattern of women's burials across the Viking world tells a consistent story about what mattered. The oval brooches, those pairs of bronze or silver dome-shaped brooches that held the shoulders of the Norse woman's outer dress, appear in women's graves across the entire Norse world, from Norway to Iceland to Ireland to Russia. They are a kind of signature, a marker of Norse female identity that crossed geographical boundaries. The beads that Norse women wore were often exotic. Glass beads from the Rhineland, beads of amber from the Baltic, beads of carnelian from the Middle East, coming to Scandinavia through trade networks that stretched thousands of miles. A woman's bead string could be a map of the global trade routes of her world. Each bead had been through many hands before it reached her neck. The combs found in women's graves, made of antler typically with fine teeth for untangling long hair, small objects, grooming tools, personal care items. The presence of a comb in a grave suggests someone who took care of her appearance, who maintained herself, who was a person with a face, with hair, with the ordinary human concern for how she looked. These small things pull at something: the key ring, the bead necklace, the comb, the spindle whorl. These are not the grand objects of rulers and warriors. They are the things of an ordinary life, an extraordinarily ordinary life, conducted in difficult conditions with skill and persistence. The DNA revolution in archaeology has transformed what we know about Viking Age women specifically. Ancient DNA analysis can now tell us not only the biological sex of skeletal remains, which was previously estimated from physical characteristics that are less reliable, but also the geographic origins of individuals, their relatedness to other individuals, their physical traits. This has led to some significant findings. The Burka warrior, BJ 581 as we discussed, but also broader population studies that reveal the degree to which women participated in the Norse diaspora. Studies of the early Icelandic population have found that the majority of the founding male settlers appear to have Scandinavian ancestry, while a substantial minority of the founding female settlers appear to have ancestry from the British Isles, Ireland and Scotland primarily. This matches the historical record, which suggests that Norsemen took wives and female slaves from the British Isles as they settled in Iceland. But it also means that Icelandic culture, that remarkable Norse culture that produced the sagas, the Eddas, the legal tradition, was in significant part the product of women who were not originally Norse, who came from Ireland or Scotland voluntarily or not, and whose cultural contributions are embedded in what became Icelandic tradition in ways we cannot fully disentangle. The Irish influence on Icelandic culture, the possible influence of Irish literary tradition on the saga form, of Irish Christian practice on Icelandic Christianity, of Irish folk tradition on Icelandic belief, may in part be a female influence, brought by women who carried their own culture in their memory and passed it to their children alongside the Norse traditions of their husbands. The artifacts found in domestic contexts, near hearths in storage areas, in the spaces clearly associated with everyday household life, are dominated by textile production tools and kitchen equipment. Spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, shears, quern stones for grinding grain, cooking pots, buckets, bowls, the detritus of the woman's work. These spaces, these objects, feel inhabited in a way that the grand burial mounds sometimes don't. The broken spindle whorl in the corner, the patched textile, the worn quern stone. These are the marks of actual use, of actual life, of hands that held these things every day for years and wore them smooth. There's one more category of archaeological evidence I want to mention, because it's both unexpected and touching. Runic inscriptions. Runes, the letters of the Norse writing system, were carved into wood, stone, metal, and bone for various purposes. Memorial stones, ownership marks, messages, charms, and among the runic inscriptions, there are some that were made by or for women. There are memorial stones that name women, either as the person being commemorated or as the person who commissioned the stone. A woman who had a memorial stone carved in her honor was a woman of enough standing that her community thought she deserved to be permanently named in stone. And a woman who commissioned a stone for a husband or a son was a woman with enough resources and authority to initiate that project. There are also inscriptions that express love or grief. Brief, simple, but genuinely moving. The person who carved a name into stone so it would last. The person who wanted to say, in some permanent way, that this person had existed and had mattered. And there are ownership inscriptions, marks that identify objects as belonging to a specific person. Made this. This belongs to Y, including occasionally marks that identify female owners or makers. The woman who scratched her name into a comb or a weaving tool was saying something simple. This is mine. I was here. We are very deep into the night now. The Norse world has been with us for a long time. We have been quiet guests in its longhouses and burial mounds and assembly grounds. We have listened to the Velva and watched Gudrid sing and followed Odd's ship across the gray North Atlantic. Let's settle in for a little while longer. There are a few more things to say. We have been talking for the most part about free women, about women with some degree of standing and legal protection. But we should not leave unacknowledged the women at the bottom of the Norse social order. The thralls, the enslaved. Slavery was an integral part of the Viking Age economy. It was not an aberration or a marginal practice. It was central, both to the domestic economy of Norse households and to the trading economy of the wider Norse world. Viking raiders took slaves. This was one of the primary purposes of raiding, not just gold and silver, but people. Human beings who could be sold in the slave markets of Hedeby or Dublin or the Volga trading posts, or kept for use in the raider's own household, or traded further east into the Islamic world, where Norse slave traders sold human cargo at markets in Russia and along the Caspian Sea. Women were enslaved in large numbers. The specific targets of Viking raids, monasteries, coastal settlements, islands, were places where women children were relatively accessible. The women taken in raids might be used as domestic servants in Norse households, as concubines, as workers in the agricultural and textile economy. They might be sold. They might be given as gifts. They had no legal standing and no protection beyond whatever mercy their owners chose to show. The Old Norse word for a female slave was thigh. The world of the thigh is largely invisible in the historical record. These were people without legal standing, without the ability to own property, without the right to appear before the thing or to seek redress for wrongs done to them. Their lives were defined entirely by the needs and desires of their owners. Archaeological evidence for the enslaved is difficult to identify. People buried without grave goods, with nothing, may have been enslaved. But not everyone without grave goods was enslaved, and the absence of grave goods is not definitive evidence. What we do have is the evidence from the Oseberg burial and others of human sacrifice, the killing of a person to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The Oseberg burial, as we mentioned, contained 2 women. One of them may have been sacrificed to accompany the other. If so, she was almost certainly a slave. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, in his famous account of the funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga, describes in vivid and horrifying detail the sacrifice of a slave woman to accompany her master in death. The account is extremely detailed and extremely disturbing, and we will not dwell on it at length here, because this is a sleep script and not a horror script. But it is worth acknowledging because it represents a reality of the Norse world that existed alongside everything else we have discussed. Enslaved women were also sometimes freed. Their freedom might be granted by a generous master, or might be earned, or might be purchased. Odd the Deep-Minded freed her slaves in Iceland and gave them land. This was remarkable enough to be specifically noted in the sagas. The freed person, the freedman or freedwoman, was not a full free citizen, but they were no longer property. Their children could, over generations, become fully integrated into free society. This was one of the paths out of slavery. It was not a guaranteed path, but it existed. The women at the margins of Norse society included not just the enslaved, but also the outcasts, people who had been declared outlaws, stripped of their legal standing, and effectively expelled from society. Outlawry was a significant legal punishment in the Norse world, especially in Iceland, where it was one of the most severe sanctions available to the courts. Women could be outlawed, though it was rarer than male outlawry. More commonly, a woman might find herself effectively marginalized by circumstances. The widow without male protection, the woman whose family was killed and who had no one to advocate for her at the thing. The older woman who outlived her utility in the eyes of a society organized around productive labor. The woman accused of witchcraft. The accusation of witchcraft, of being a seithkona or a trollkona in a negative sense, could be used to marginalize and destroy a woman's reputation. The same spiritual practices that made the vulva respected could, when reframed, make a woman dangerous and ostracized. The line between the revered seeress and the feared witch was thin and could be crossed by public opinion alone. As Christianity came in and the magical practices became more unambiguously negative in the official view, the women who continued them became increasingly vulnerable. The wise woman who knew the herbs and the old charms could find herself accused. The woman who had visions could be called a witch. The transition from vulva to witch did not require any change in the woman herself, only a change in how her community chose to interpret what she did. Let's also acknowledge the women of the margins who chose their position, or who were differently understood by their community. There are references in Norse sources to women who dressed as men, who took on male roles and identities. The term skalmald, sword time, was used for periods of violence and upheaval, and there are accounts of women who cut their hair and took up weapons during such periods. Whether these are historical accounts or literary devices is hard to say. There is also the complex territory of gender in the Norse world more broadly. The concept of urgi, that quality associated with unmanliness, suggests that gender was performed and could be transgressed in ways that the culture recognized and hadn't terminology for. The man who practiced seidr was committing ergi, because seidr was feminine. A woman who practiced masculine things was in a different category, sometimes celebrated as exceptional, sometimes regarded with discomfort. The Shieldmaiden figure lives in this territory. The woman who transgresses gender norms in ways that are remarkable precisely because they are transgressive. She is interesting not despite, but because of her departure from the expected. We've talked about the sagas at length. Now let's spend some time with the other great body of Norse literary tradition, the Eddas, and think about what they tell us about how the Norse world imagined women. The Poetic Edda is a collection of Old Norse mythological and heroic poems, preserved primarily in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript called the Codex Regius. These poems are believed to preserve much older traditions. Some may go back to the earliest Viking age or before, though this is disputed. They deal with the gods, with mythological heroes, with the cosmological framework of the Norse world. The Prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, a remarkable scholar, politician poet who compiled Norse mythology systematically for what appear to have been partly literary and partly preservationist purposes. The Prose Edda is our main source for a great deal of Norse mythological tradition. In both of these sources, women appear prominently, not always as the central figures, but consistently, in ways that shape the narrative. The Voluspa, the prophecy of the vulva, is the first poem in the Poetic Edda and one of the most important texts in all of Norse literature. And it is narrated by a woman, a vulva speaking directly to Odin, recounting the creation of the world and prophesying its end. From the very first lines, the voice of the poem is female. She is old. She remembers things from before time. She is commanding. She tells Odin to listen, and he does. The king of the gods, the one who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, the one who hanged himself on the world tree to learn the runes, he sits and listens to this woman tell him what she knows. She tells the creation. She tells the war between the Aesir and the Vanir. She tells the death of Baldur. She tells the coming of Ragnarok, the great ending, the burning, the drowning, the silence. And then she tells what comes after. A new world rising from the sea. A new sun in the skies. Gods who survive. Gods who will return. A world reborn. And then the poem ends. The vulva has spoken. She goes back down. The vision is over. The choice to frame this enormous cosmological poem through a female voice. A woman who sees everything, who holds all of time in her knowledge, is interesting. The Norse tradition understood wisdom, prophecy, and the deepest knowledge not as exclusively male, but as accessible through the feminine. The vulva sees what Odin cannot see, or what he needs her to say for him. The heroic poems of the Eddas give us remarkable female figures as well. Brynhilde in the German tradition. Brunhild is one of the great tragic figures of Norse Germanic legend. She appears in the Volsunga saga and in several Eddic poems as a Shieldmaiden who was placed into an enchanted sleep by Odin as punishment for defying him and saved by the hero Sigurður. Brynhilde is magnificent and devastating. She is wise, she is fierce, she is deeply in love with Sigurður. The tragedy of her story is the story of thwarted love twisted into catastrophe. Through deception and magic and the interlocking obligations of the heroic code, she ends up married to the wrong man, watching Sigurður married to another woman who has been made to forget her. And the result is destruction on an operatic scale. Brynhilde ultimately causes Sigurdur's death and then kills herself on his funeral pyre. Not from grief, or not only from grief, but from a desire to be with him in death, since they could not be together in life. And on the pyre, she speaks, she prophesies, she explains, she holds nothing back. She is not a passive victim. She is a fully realized tragic figure who makes choices, terrible choices, choices that destroy people she loves and people she doesn't, and understands what she is doing and why. The Norse tradition does not simplify her. Gudrun Gjúkadóttir, a different Gudrun from Laxdæla saga, but equally famous, is Brynhilde's counterpart in tragedy. Her husband Sigurður is killed, in large part through Brynhilde's manipulation. Her brothers then kill her second husband. She is then married off to Atli, the king of the Huns, against her will. And when Atli kills her brothers, Gudrun takes her revenge. She kills Atli's sons, her own sons by him, and serves their hearts and blood to Atli at a feast without telling him what he's eating. Then she kills Atli himself. Then she burns the hall. And then she tries to drown herself in the sea and fails, because the sea won't take her, and she washes up on a foreign shore and eventually dies very much later after even more catastrophe. Gudrun's revenge is horrific. It is meant to be horrific. The Norse tradition is not presenting it as good or admirable, but it is presenting a woman who, having been subjected to every possible loss and violation, finds a way to act, whose agency by the end is expressed in the only way left to her. It is a story about what happens when all the normal pathways are closed. When you have no legal recourse, no ally, no protection, no husband who is faithful, no brothers who survive. When all you have left is the most extreme act available. It is not a comfortable story. It is not meant to be. We are moving toward the end of our evening together. The stars are very old, and the fjords are very dark, and all those women, Gudrun with her dreams, Odd with her ship, Gudrid with her spindle at the edge of America, the Osberg women sealed in their ship beneath the mound, the vulva descending from her trance, all of them are resting somewhere in the deep past. Let's drift toward a close. Here we are then. The night has gone on a long time and we have traveled a long way. We've been through the longhouses and the burial mounds, the thing and the sail weaving, the Sather trance and the mead horn, the sagas and the Eddas and the DNA reports from modern labs analyzing thousand-year-old bones. And what have we found? We've found women who were not what the popular imagination usually thinks of when it thinks of Vikings. Not background figures, not passive decorations in a male world. Not simply the women left behind while the men went raiding. Something more complicated, more interesting, more fully human than that. We've found women with keys, women with authority over the material survival of their households. Women who managed economies, managed children, managed guests, managed the spiritual relationship with the ancestral dead. We've found women who could divorce. In the 9th century, when almost nobody else in the medieval world could. We've found women who may have fought. Women who certainly managed estates and wielded political influence. Women who crossed the North Atlantic in small wooden boats and built new societies on frozen islands. We've found women who saw the future, or who were believed to see the future, which amounts to the same thing in terms of the power it gave them. Women who mediated between the living and the dead, between the human world and the divine world. We found women in grief, formal, public, fierce grief that was their right and their role. Women whose losses shaped the narrative of their world as much as any battle or raid. We've found women who made extraordinary things with their hands and were buried with those things and with the tools they used to make them. And we've found at the edges women who were enslaved and exploited and killed. Women who were married off without real choice and spent their lives in hard circumstances. Women who fell through the cracks of a society that was, for all its remarkable qualities, still a society that regarded women as secondary in public life, and treated their bodies and their futures as negotiable resources. All of it was real. All of it was the same world. The Norse world ended in a sense. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, as Scandinavia integrated into the broader Christian European world. The things that made Norse culture distinctive, the paganism, the legal traditions, the oral literature, the particular forms of social organization, were absorbed, transformed, modified. The Vikings became Scandinavians. The Jarls became Christian aristocrats. The Thing became a feudal court. The vulva became a witch. But the women didn't go anywhere. They were there through all of it, managing, adapting, continuing. The Icelandic literary tradition, the sagas, the Eddas, the skaldic poetry, was written down and preserved largely in the 12th and 13th centuries, generations after the pagan Viking age had ended. The people who wrote it down were Christian, literate, sophisticated. But they were writing about a world their grandparents or great-grandparents had known. They were preserving something. And in that preservation, the women came through. Not always center stage, not always fully realized, but present, recognizable, doing the things they always did. Gudrun of Laxdæla saga, sitting in her old age, wrapped in her grief and her faith, saying she was worse to the one she loved most. Awed of the deep mind, buried upright in her ship, in the Icelandic soil she had claimed. Gudrid, who had seen America and Rome and the Sather ceremony in Greenland, finally quiet in her little hermitage. They sit with us in the dark. They're not dramatic about it. They're not asking to be seen. They just are. And perhaps that's the most Norse thing of all. The quiet persistence, the keeping going when the keeping going is all there is. The Norse cosmos knew it would end. Ragnarok was coming. The gods knew it and feasted anyway. They trained and prepared and laughed in Valhalla, and knew that at the end the wolf would swallow the sun. And the women in the longhouses knew that their lives were hard and often short and full of loss. And they checked the stores, and they wound the spindle, and they brewed the ale, and they welcomed the guests, and they sang Seeresses over the dead, and they kept going. The spindle is still. The fire has gone down to a glow. Somewhere outside, across a landscape that has not changed as much as you'd think, the dawn is considering whether to show up. But not yet. We have a little more time. It's very late now. Or very early. These things blur when you've been sitting by a Norse hearth for 2 hours. Let me just tell you a few more small things. Little details. The kind that get left out of the big histories, but that are somehow the most true. Norse women probably sang while they worked. Spinning and weaving are rhythmic work, and rhythm and song go naturally together. We don't have the songs. They were not written down, or if they were, they haven't survived. But the tradition of women's work songs is ancient and nearly universal. And it would be strange if Norse women were the exception. They braided their hair. The evidence from archaeological finds, the combs, the hairpins, the occasional preserved hair in exceptional burial conditions, suggests that Norse women wore their hair long and braided or pinned. This was not simply vanity. Long braided hair was a mark of womanhood. A free woman's hair was her own. When a thrall woman was enslaved, her hair might be cut, marking her new status. They told stories to their children at night. In a world without books, in a world where the fire was the only light, and the winter nights were very long, the stories told in the Longhouse were the primary entertainment and education. The myths of the gods, the adventures of ancestors, the old tales that explained why the world was the way it was. Mothers told these stories to children who told them to their children, who eventually told them to the scholars who wrote them down. The chain of transmission runs through the women. They missed people. In a world where raids took men away, and they didn't always come back. In a world where children died, and parents aged and friends moved to new settlements on new islands. The Norse women lived with absence as a constant companion. They missed people. They remembered them. They poured a little ale for the dead at the great festivals and hoped the dead were satisfied. They looked at the northern lights. You can't live in Norway or Iceland and not be aware of the northern lights. The aurora borealis on a clear winter night is one of the most spectacular things in the natural world, and the Norse people had explanations for it. It was the light from the shields of the Valkyries, reflecting as they rode across the sky, or it was the fire of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge between the worlds. Whatever they believed about what caused it, they looked at it. On a clear winter night, a woman stepping out of the Longhouse to check on the animals or empty a bucket would look up and see the lights moving across the sky. Green and white and occasionally red. Silent and vast and entirely indifferent to her small life. And she would stand there for a moment, watching. And then she would go back inside, because it was cold and there was work to do in the morning. That's the Norse world. That's the women in it. Not the horned helmets and the dramatic raids and the thunderous feasting halls, though those things existed too. But the moment of standing outside in the cold and looking up at something beautiful and then going back to work. The keys on the belt, the spindle that never quite stops turning, the ale that needs to be checked, the stores that need to be counted, the child that needs to be held, the guest that needs to be fed, the dead that need to be remembered, the long, slow, essential work of keeping everyone alive, done by people who are long gone now, who left behind their spindle whorls and their oval brooches and their bead necklaces, and the faint traces of their lives in the DNA of their descendants, and the words of the stories that were written, down finally when there was no longer anyone left who had known them directly. They were there, they mattered, they kept the lights on, and now they're sleeping. And so, with any luck, are you. The Longhouse is dark and quiet. The fire is banked down to its last warmth. The wind off the fjord has stilled. The Norse women have gone to their rest. You can go to yours. Before we truly close the Longhouse door, let's wander a little further. Because there are women in the Norse world we haven't met yet, and it would be a shame to let the night end without a few more introductions. Think of this as a slow tour through the back corridors of the Great Hall. Quieter rooms, less famous figures. But no less interesting for that. Let's talk about Thora Hlaðahyrna. That's Thora Hlaðahorn in something approaching English. She appears in the saga tradition as one of the early ancestors of the Norwegian Jarls of Leh, a powerful noble family who were significant players in Norwegian politics before and during the Viking Age. The name Thora was common among Norse noblewomen, which makes keeping track of them a slight headache. But this particular Thora is associated with a story that has a very Norse flavor to it. She was supposedly kept from marrying by a serpent, a great snake or dragon that wrapped itself around her bower and could not be removed or killed. Her father offered her in marriage to any man who could slay the serpent. And the man who managed it was Ragnar Lothbrok, the semi-legendary Viking hero whose name will ring a bell for anyone who watches a certain television show. Ragnar, in the legend, wore hairy or shaggy trousers to protect himself from the serpent's venom, and killed it, and married Thora. And by all accounts, the marriage was a happy one, at least until Thora died, and Ragnar went off to have various other adventures and marriages. She is depicted in the tradition as beautiful, gentle, beloved. Her death is what sends Ragnar back into the wider world of chaos and raiding. This kind of story, the woman in need of rescue from a supernatural impediment, the hero who proves himself by slaying the monster, the marriage as reward, is a familiar heroic structure. What's worth noting is that Thora's own character is not entirely eclipsed by it. She is described as having genuine virtue and intelligence. The saga tradition gives her some interiority even within a story that is fundamentally about her as prize. How much of Thora is historical is, as always, impossible to know. But she appears in the genealogies. She has a consistent presence in the tradition. And the Earls of Lade may well have had a real ancestress named Thora, from whom they traced their lineage. Sigrid Storrada, Sigrid the Haughty, as she tends to be translated. Now here is a woman with a reputation. Sigrid appears in the Norse saga tradition as a queen, first of Sweden, in some accounts, and subsequently associated with the Danish king Sven Forkbeard. She is depicted as a woman of great pride and considerable political savvy, which in the source tradition mostly means she is depicted as someone who does not accept being condescended to. The stories associated with Sigrid include one in which two minor kings who wished to court her were lodged in the same hall and, being drunk and quarrelsome, began to fight and destroy the hall. Sigrid reportedly had them burned alive in the hall for their poor behavior, which is a strong response to a first date gone wrong. But the story was clearly told to establish something about her character. She did not suffer fools, and she had the power to ensure they suffered appropriately. The story for which she is most famous involves Olaf Tryggvason, the Norwegian king, who was aggressively converting Scandinavia to Christianity. Olaf, apparently, sent a proposal of marriage to Sigrid. Sigrid, a pagan, was not entirely opposed to the match, but she stipulated that she would not convert. Olaf, deeply committed to Christianity, struck her across the face when she said this. Sigurd's response was that this would be his death, and she proceeded to organize a coalition of his enemies, including her eventual husband Sven Forkbeard of Denmark, who did in fact defeat and kill Olaf at the Battle of Svolder in 1000 CE. Whether or not the slap actually happened, or whether Sigrid was as central to the coalition against Olaf as the saga suggests, the tradition about her conveys something interesting. A woman who was slighted by a man who thought he could push her around, and who responded by engineering his destruction through patient political maneuvering. Whether historical or legendary, Sigrid is a figure of political intelligence. The sagas didn't invent her whole cloth. She appears in enough different traditions that she seems to have some historical grounding. But she has also clearly been shaped by the tradition into a particular kind of figure. The woman of great pride who does not forget a wrong. Let's drift to a gentler story. Melkorka. Melkorka appears in Laxdæla saga, the same saga that gave us Gudrun og Swiftsdottir, and she is one of the most affecting figures in the whole text. Melkorka was an Irish princess who was captured in a raid and sold as a slave. When we meet her, she is at a slave market, being sold, and she is mute, or apparently mute. She does not speak. The man who buys her, a wealthy Icelander named Höskuldur, takes her home to Iceland, and she remains in his household as a concubine. She bears him a son named Olafur. And then one day Olafur, who is a toddler, hears Melkorka speaking, clearly, fluently. She is speaking Irish to her son. She has been speaking Irish to her son in secret, teaching him her language, keeping a piece of herself alive in this private communication with this child. It is revealed that she is not mute at all. She has been maintaining her silence as a form of resistance, or perhaps as a form of grief. The loss of her language's context, the absence of anyone to speak it to meaningfully, the decision not to perform for her captors in a language she hadn't chosen to be here to speak. When her secret language is discovered, when it becomes clear that she is a woman of education and high birth, the saga's attitude toward her shifts. Höskuldur is some taste. Her son Olafur, who is clearly his father's son and of high status, begins to take his mother seriously in a new way. And eventually Olafur travels to Ireland to find Melkorka's family. He meets her father, an Irish king, who is old and grieving the daughter he lost years ago. And he tells the old man who his mother was, what became of her, that she had a son, that the son came. It is a quietly devastating sequence. The enslaved princess who maintained her silence. The child who learned a secret language at his mother's knee. The old king who never stopped missing his daughter. Melkorka herself dies before Olafur returns to tell her what he found. She doesn't get the ending the story sets up for her. She dies still in Iceland, still in reduced circumstances, despite her son's rising status. But she taught him Irish. She gave him something of herself that nobody could take. There is a woman in Njal's saga, a saga that we have mentioned several times, and which contains more interesting women per page than almost any other Norse text, named Bergthora Skarphéthinsdóttir. Bergthora is the wife of Njal, the eponymous protagonist of the saga, and she is a formidable presence. The saga is fundamentally about a blood feud that escalates over decades and involves dozens of families and eventually ends in the burning of Njal's homestead with Njal and most of his family inside. It is one of the most complex and in some ways most tragic of the sagas. Bergthora is involved in triggering elements of the feud. She and Hallgerður, Gunnar's wife, have their own parallel feud going on. A series of tit-for-tat killings of servants that mirrors and escalates the tensions between the main characters. Bergthora is not a passive presence. She makes decisions. She gives orders. She matches Hallgerður move for move in the escalating domestic Cold War. But the moment in the saga for which Bergthora is most remembered is the burning. When the enemies come to burn the hall, Njal and Bergthora are offered the chance to leave with the women and children. And Bergthora refuses. She is old, she says. She has slept in Njal's bed for a long time. She will not leave it now. She goes with Njal. She lies down with him. She pulls a hide over both of them. And the hall burns. They find the bodies later and they are unburned, protected by the hide, preserved. Bergthora did not have to die in that fire. She chose to. She chose to lie down with her husband rather than leave him. And the saga records her choice without drama, without explanation, simply as the decision of a woman who knew what she was doing. It is a very old kind of love, not romantic in any modern sense, just absolute. One more figure before we close. Her name is Un, or sometimes Thurither. She appears in multiple sagas under different names, and she may or may not be a single historical figure or a composite. She is a landowner, a widow, a woman who managed an estate through difficult years. There is nothing particularly dramatic about her. She doesn't initiate a blood feud or prophesy the future or sail to America. She just runs her farm. Year after year, she makes good decisions about the livestock. She maintains good relationships with her neighbors. She keeps the household together after her husband's death. Her children do well. Her grandchildren inherit a farm in good condition. The sagas mention her briefly as part of the genealogical record. A few lines, no dramatic scenes. But she was real, or something like her was real. The woman whose name appears in the genealogy as a link in the chain between her husband's family and her grandson's success. The woman who held things together for 20 years so the next generation could go on. She has the least glamorous story of anyone we've talked about tonight. She's also probably the most representative. Most Viking women were Thurither, were the woman whose name appears once in a genealogy and is otherwise invisible. They managed their farms. They raised their children. They spun their wool. They brewed their ale. They welcomed their guests and buried their dead and counted their stores and checked on their animals in the winter dark and looked up at the northern lights for a moment before going back inside. Because there was work to do. They were not extraordinary. They were not legendary. They were not the subjects of sagas or the recipients of ship burials. They were just the people who kept everything going. And because of them, because of the Uns and the Thurithers and the nameless women's whose spindle whorls we find in the ground, the rest of it was possible. The sagas and the voyages and the trade routes and the settlements, all of it. Built on the foundation of women doing the essential, invisible work, we owe them something. At least the acknowledgement that they were there. That their work mattered. That they were real. The fire has gone completely cold now. The Longhouse is dark. Outside, across the fjord, the sky is starting to think about lightning. Just the first gray suggestion of it. Nothing dramatic. Just the gradual return of the world. In 1,000 years, someone will look at the ground where this Longhouse stood and find a spindle whorl in the soil. A small round weight, slightly smoothed. They'll hold it in their palm and wonder who held it last. What her name was. What she was thinking about. Spinning in the firelight, in the long Scandinavian winter 1,000 years ago. She was probably thinking about what needed to be done tomorrow. She was probably tired. She was possibly sent asleep. And so are you. Good night. Sleep well. The stores are counted, and the ale is good, and the keys are safe on your belt. Everything is taken care of.